how are you going to connect with this person who has come into our church this morning and has never been in a church like this before? How are you as a leader going to make eye contact with them and connect with them and sort of involve them in the worship experience?
Hey, I'm Andrea Olson. I've been leading worship and training worship leaders for nearly 20 years, and my mission is to support worship leaders just like you in volunteer-supported ministries because I know what it's like. I've been there. It's amazing, but you have a big job, and sometimes you might feel a little bit alone. But I'm here to remind you that you aren't. We'll cover spiritual and leadership growth, practical resources, and get encouragement from other worship leaders from all over the world. I truly want to see you lead from the overflow, not the overwhelm. So grab a cup of tea or coffee and join me. Welcome to the Overflow Worship Podcast. Well, I love that through the Overflow Worship Podcast, I get to talk with people from all over the world. And I have met somebody new recently, and we were just chatting before we hit record that it's surprising we haven't met yet, but I'm really excited that we finally get to. And so I'm really just grateful to welcome David Santistevan from Beyond Sunday Worship to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. It's really an honor to be here. And likewise, I'm so excited to be able to meet you and see what you're doing with Overflow Worship. And it's rare for me to be on like this side of an interview.
Yeah.
So mostly I'm interviewing lots of people, been doing that for a lot of years, but I'm looking forward to this. This should be fun.
Yes, amazing. Well, I'm glad to have you in this seat for once. Well,
Yes.
why don't you kick it off and tell everybody a little bit about you?
Yeah, so I feel like I have been in worship ministry like my whole life, which is not exactly true, but it feels like that. Like from womb until the present day, I feel like I've been involved in worship ministry in some way, which is funny because neither of my parents are musicians, singers, worship leaders. They were always in church and leaders within the church, but not of the musical sort. But yeah, I hail from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so I'm from the Northeast and grew up there and got involved in worship basically when I was in middle school or so, started playing keys, eventually kind of started to lead worship reluctantly. Didn't really want to do it, but was sort of pushed to do it. And so I'm just giving you the flyby here, like of my
I love
my
it.
life story
Yeah.
a little bit, but was involved in my local church, Allison Park Church in the North Hills of Pittsburgh. Just a wonderful place to grow up in. I went to school in Minneapolis, Minnesota at North Central University, came back to my home church on staff. And this was like early 2000s, maybe 2006 or so. I came back and was on staff and was there for 12 years as a worship pastor. And met my wife there. So my wife, Emily, we have 2 kids. We have a 12-year-old son, Tyler, a 10-year-old daughter, Eliana. And we are now here in the Orlando area after a season of traveling full-time. We were full-time RVers where we traveled the country,
Wow.
did ministry on the road, but also just saw lots of sights and experienced a lot of beauty in this country. And now I help churches, I coach worship leaders, I podcast, all of those kinds of things, and I love it. So,
That is amazing. What a cool journey. And I'm sure for you, it's awesome to look back and see how God ordered those steps and how every stop along the way was part of the story and part of what he's building, bringing you to this point. So are you on staff at a church right now, or are you solely like digging in and training churches, worship leaders and stuff like that?
yeah, so I am not on staff at a church. So I was for 12 years, full-time worship pastor, did young adult ministry in that season as well. And about close to 8 years ago now is when I came off staff full-time at my local church. And that's when we kind of hit the road as a family. We went full-time on the road. And ever since then, I have not been on full-time staff, but I've spent my time helping churches. So I work with an organization called Slingshot, and what we do
Oh,
is we
yeah.
help staff. So I do a lot of
Yes.
kind of networking and coaching leaders and helping to connect them to new opportunities with great local churches all over the country, but also one-on-one coaching with worship leaders and training. And I still do lead worship. So I'll travel at times to lead worship. I have a home church here in the Orlando area that we're serving in. And so it's a sweet season, Andrea, but there's a part of me that does miss the full-time ministry of being with the same people, investing in a team week in and week out. I'm missing that a little bit, 8 years removed from it, still very involved in church ministry, but just kind of in a different seat right now.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Wow, that is incredible. And we love Slingshot. I've worked with them throughout various seasons or, connected with them because a church that I attend or am working with is working with Slingshot. And so that's awesome. I love that. And I would imagine you've heard a lot of stories, met a lot of people, seen a lot of churches in different stages, right? In different seasons. And so what are some of the common threads? If you were to look back and think like, man, I feel like I say this at every church, every worship leader that I work with or coach or talk to, you find yourself saying maybe one similar thing. What would that be?
Yeah, it's interesting to evaluate the areas of worship ministry, even as I look at my lifetime. So I'm turning 40 this year, and just looking back on the different eras of worship and local church ministry and just how it has evolved so much. I think we're like in an interesting time in worship ministry right now, sort of coming out of this long season where it's like an era of excellence, I like to call it sometimes. Just where, like when I grew up in worship ministry, it was just sort of like kind of a free for all. Like, let's just put whoever can play any kind of instrument. Oh, what drums are? Okay, you're playing this Sunday kind of a thing. Like, and we just make it work, right? And we're doing our best, but it was a little chaotic, right? And then we had so much excellence just increase in the local church where the advent of tracks and clicks and live production, and some of that sort of coming from a movement of church that was like, hey, let's increase our excellence so that we can attract more people into our building, so that this is a place where people feel comfortable, where they feel inspired, where they feel excited. And I think all of those things has been good. But it seems like to me that we are finding ourselves in a place where we feel a little bit discontent just with the show a little bit and the production. And I think those are all great tools, but when the tool becomes something that is primary or something that we just rest on, rather than going deeper in worship and finding what the true meaning of it is, I think we lose our way. And so what I'm seeing with worship leaders is like a little bit of that discontent, and the Lord sort of returning us to a place of giving voice to the people of God, where it's less about the spectacle and the talent and how incredible things are on your stage, and more about like, what's God doing in the room, and how are we as people in worship ministry empowering the local church to find her voice in worship. And so I love just the sound of God's people singing, and I feel like more worship leaders are finding that like, it's not just about how great our songs are. It's not just about how great we sound, but hey, are we really connecting with our people and helping them to sing and to worship? And then we're just kind of getting out of the way, right? We're just facilitators. Like, we're not the focus, And so I feel like there's just been a little bit of a returning to that, of a return to more authenticity, more simplicity, while still utilizing those helpful tools, but in a way that it's not the end, right? It's a tool to help us get to where we need to be in worship. So
yeah, absolutely. I agree completely, and I see that too, and I sense that in my own spirit. Just that that Matt Redman song, "Heart of Worship," right? Like, I feel like we're coming back to that, and we need to come back to that, and not that, like you said, not that production is bad. It's just that it needs to be, the mindset around it needs to be different, right? So do you think that we as a collective, as worship leaders, as the church, do we realize what that discontent is? It's just there's an unrest, but we can't quite put our finger on it. Or do you find that worship leaders are like, no, I know what it is. I just got to figure out how to get there?
I don't know if we all do know what it is, because when you're in worship ministry, there's sort of a lot on your shoulders, right? Because you are reporting to your senior pastor, you have a senior leader that's kind of telling you to do this, right? And depending on your denomination, you have certain expectations. And so I think it's really hard to navigate what success looks like. I think a lot of senior leaders have maybe produced or over controlled the worship experience, understandably, right? Because we kind of came out of a season where there was just the excellence and the quality was so bad that it was a little embarrassing, right? And like senior leaders, like if we're going to grow our churches, like we need to improve our worship. So we need better vocals, we need better musicians, we need better sound, all of those things, right? And so but you tend to overproduce kind of that worship experience. And I think you can sort of ride that out, right? Just like, okay, we've got our systems in place, we have our structures in place, and then it's just like execute the plan every Sunday, like just kind of run that play. But I feel like we have to look at the bigger picture. And so as a worship leader, it's hard, right? Because you're just kind of, you're being communicated and in different ways, and you have kind of different pressures from different sides. But what this can do is it can open up healthy dialogue with senior leadership. Never as a worship leader do you want to just like, okay, I'm just going to kind of do my own thing, right? It all has to be done in community and conversation and mutual respect between executive leadership and creatives, kind of getting on the same page together and say, okay, our excellence is better than it's ever been, but is our worship as healthy as it needs to be? Like, what's next for us? Like, what's the next level? And just facilitating those conversations, I think are really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like more than ever, I've been having conversations with worship leaders about those conversations and communication between them and their senior leadership, and them feeling like maybe ill-equipped for that conversation, or feeling like they're not quite sure how to open up that dialogue. And so how do you coach leaders through that? Like if a worship leader comes to you and is like, I don't feel like I can talk to my senior leadership about this, but this is what the tension is, what I'm sensing, but the excellence, expectation is there. And how do I bridge this gap? How do I talk to them about it? Like, what are some of the tips that you give them, or maybe some of the starting blocks that you walk them through?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it comes down to like slowing down and taking a deep breath and understanding one another. A lot of this is like human psychology and different personalities, and trying to understand where the other person is coming from, right? Oftentimes there's so much tension between like executive leadership and the way that they think, and a worship leader who's like super creative and how they think.
Yes.
And there's just this. Now, I've seen it work in really great ways where there's mutual respect and there's understanding, but also where it just doesn't work really well, and it ends very poorly because both sides don't make the effort to understand one another. So what I encourage a worship leader to do, oftentimes it starts with that, lower on the totem pole, sort of leading up and initiating that conversation. But understanding the vantage point of where your senior leader is coming from, even laying aside your own dreams and laying aside your own vision to sit down with your senior leader and say, hey, what do you believe about worship? What do you really value in a worship experience? Like, what am I doing really well? And what are some areas that I could work on? That sort of humility will open up deeper conversations and will open up further opportunities down the road. when a senior leader feels like you don't respect them or you're not kind of owning the vision of the house and you're sort of off doing your own thing, that's how you sort of kill relationship, right? But if they see you making efforts to, I believe in this place, I believe in the vision, I care more about this church than I just care even about the worship set and my role. Like, I
Yeah.
want to see people come to Christ. I want to see people discipled. Like, I care about how the kids ministry is doing. I care about this
Yeah.
place. Those sort of efforts from your seat as a worship leader to own the vision of your senior leader are just so important, right? Because if you build
Mhm.
that trust, if you build that respect, then they're more likely to look at what you want to do personally and in your team. Say you have a big vision that's maybe outside of what the church has done before. They're more likely to look at that and say, okay, like I kind of understand where you're coming from. Let's do it because you're bought into this vision, right? So
Yep.
just leading with humility and approaching it like, how can I serve this place better? And then just leading up and facilitating those kind of healthy conversations. It's just so important. If you wait for your senior leader to come to you, it may never happen, right? Depending on who
Yeah.
your pastor is. So you have to be able to lead up in those ways. So those are just a
hmm
couple things, I guess.
Yeah, so good. Oh man, I bet you everyone listening or watching is just taking notes because that is so good. And you're right. And I think sometimes as worship leaders, it's hard for us to remember that our senior leaders have a whole different set of responsibilities and a whole different set of, you know, day-to-day things that they face, just like we do, just like every worship leader does. But oftentimes we can miss one another because we can run in separate directions if we're not careful. And so I think that's such wise advice for people to think about, hey, how can I approach my senior leadership? How can I, show them, not just tell them, but show them that I really believe in the vision of this church and that is that foundation that we need. I
Yeah,
love that.
trying to just really understand where they're coming from. Here's an example. When I was like a young leader, right? I came out of college and I knew what I wanted to do, right? I wanted to increase the musical quality. I wanted to get the team on clicks and tracks. I wanted to introduce new songs and new music. It was just a little outdated. It needed this refreshing. I wanted to get some younger musicians involved, all of this stuff, not bad things. But I had
hmm
no clue what I was doing in terms of standing before a multi-generational congregation
Yeah.
and knowing how to connect with them. So my pastor, he pulled me aside, and I remember this conversation distinctly, and he just brought out, here's a few different people, kind of generic people in the church, right? How are you, David, me as a worship leader, going to connect with this 85-year-old woman who's been a part of this church for 40 plus years and feels like the church has passed her by? Like, how are
Yeah.
you, as a young 20 something, going to connect with them? I'd never thought about that before. Or how are you going to connect with this person who has come into our church this morning and has never been in a church like this before? Maybe they come from a
hmm
Catholic background, and here we are in this charismatic Assemblies of God church with all these crazy
Yeah.
people dancing around with flags and raising their hands and shouting during
Yeah.
worship. How are you as a leader going to make eye contact with them and connect with them and sort of
hmm
involve them in the worship experience? Or how are
hmm
you going to connect with this teenager with his arms crossed, sitting in the back, dragged to church? And those conversations just opened me up to, what my job as a worship leader is not just to do music and singing really well, but it's to connect with
hmm
people. It's about building
Yeah.
relationship. It's about building trust.
Yes.
It's about loving people. And that's a journey, right? Like, you can pray, Lord, help me to love people more, which is a great prayer. But when you pray a prayer like that, God is going to give you opportunity to love people more, right? And it's not always going to be comfortable. It's going to be stretching. It's going to be challenging. But that really changed me. And I think those are the kind of insight that a senior leader can provide a worship leader that is so invaluable that on your own, as you're sort of in creative land most of the time, or music land most of the time, coming up with arrangements and fresh ideas and technological advances. A senior leader, they understand their people, and they can help you sort of slow down and see the bigger picture.
That is such good wisdom and such a good reminder for any of us who are feeling that tension right now. And maybe we need to look inward and ask some of those questions like, okay, what can I do? Like what can I do to support the vision of this church and to love people here well? And so I want to keep talking and talking, but our time is just about up here. And I would love to ask you, as we wrap this up, if there's anything else that you would say to a new worship leader that you wish you would have known. Because a lot of the Overflow Worship community is new worship leaders, or they're in a new church. And so is there any other advice or wisdom to put an end cap on this conversation that you would say, like, hey, if I could give you this is what I would give you?
Yeah, I love that. Andrea, what I would say is, I think sometimes those of us in local church worship ministry can be overly influenced by the worship industry.
Yeah.
And I want to be careful here, because I don't want to criticize the industry. I do all the songs of all the big artists and really appreciate what they provide for us. But you can sometimes look at what is success in worship ministry? Well, ultimate success, right, would be like a record deal, or writing a hit song, or leading worship in front of an arena of people. And we may not say that out loud, but I think it can sort of influence us. Maybe I'm subpar as a worship leader, but I just want to say this, God has placed you in your church for this time in history to love the people that he's placed in front of you. You may not be the most talented. You may not have the most resources. You may not have the biggest budget. You may not have the best musicians. Don't look at Bethel and Elevation and Maverick City and think, well, I could never do that. It's okay if you're not that good, because God can still use you right where you are to serve the people that he's placed you with. And you might be actually the best fit for the church that you're in, for the team that you lead, and to not think I have to somehow reach this sort of global influence to ultimately be successful in what I'm doing. God's called us to local influence and to invest and to lean into the people that he's placed you with. So redefine success. You're doing a great job. Keep going. Don't give up. And God's just going to continue to use you. That's what I'd say.
Amen. Wow. Well, I cannot think of a better way to wrap up this conversation. That was powerful and encouraging. And to everybody watching or listening, I hope that you were encouraged as well to keep pressing on in the ministry that God has called you to, because like David just said, he has a purpose and a plan for you in that place. David, thank you so much. Can you tell everybody, where can they find you? How can they find you on socials? Or you said you have a podcast. Tell them about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I've been doing the Beyond Sunday Worship podcast now for 11 years. So lots of interviews with over 300, like some of the guests that you have, Andrea. I've just been trying to facilitate conversations in worship that reach people from the mega church to the small country church, right? Like what are we doing as worship ministry, going behind the scenes? And so you can go to beyondsundayworship.com to find out more about that, or just go to all the places, to Spotify, to Apple Podcasts, to YouTube. My social media is D Santistevan, which is a crazy last name, but that's where you can kind of grab more of that stuff as well. But thank you, Andrea. It was really a pleasure talking with you. And just want to encourage you too to keep doing what you're doing. Like, God needs a lot of us. Well, he doesn't need us, but he uses us. And it's an honor to be able to come alongside young leaders and to empower them. And I'm grateful for what you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, likewise to you. I have just loved getting to know you a little bit more today, and what I've learned already about Beyond Sunday Worship and what you're doing has just been incredible. So thank you. Thank you for taking the time here today. And to everybody who is watching or listening, we will put all of that stuff in the show notes. So you don't have to try to spell his last name. You can click it and find it on Instagram. Or
Don't even try.
Don't even try. And everybody, thanks for tuning in today. I hope that you walked away with some practical and usable tools and tips for the ministry that God has called you to. And until next time, keep on thriving.